Executive Director of 3IE, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this launch event of the summary report of a systematic review, one of our flagship documents, on what is the impact of education programs on children's learning and school participation. When I first joined 3IE about a year and a half ago, one of the things that I was told about initially was about this work that was about to start on a systematic review on what works in education. And I thought to myself, what a great idea. I wish I had this when I was with the World Bank, where I worked for several decades, in fact, on programs to invest in education. And those of us who were at the bank then working on this were utterly convinced that education was the single highest return investment anybody could make in development. And we thought we were right, we were doing God's work, which was lucky because we often had to take leaps of faith as to what it is that actually did work in making those investments. So that's why I'm very pleased that I am associated with an organization that's actually done this major systematic review. The way we'll work this is we're going to have a presentation and a panel which I'll introduce in about a minute. But first, I'd like to ask the chairman of the board of 3IE, Richard Manning, who's formerly at DFID and the former chair of OECD DAC, to come and say a few words of introduction for us. So, Richard.
Thank you very much, Manny. It's a huge pleasure to be here and welcome you all, welcome such a large audience to this launch. As Manny says, I used to be chair of the OECD Development Assistance Committee, and 10 years ago I was involved with, along with Ruth Levine, who I think is also here, and Bill Savadoff, in the report by the Center for Global Development that led to the establishment of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. And at that time, I suppose our thought was donors are doing far too few rigorous evaluations of what they're financing. I think what we've learned over time is that two other audiences are probably more important than the donors. The first, of course, is the countries themselves. All countries, this applies to rich as well as poor countries, basically do a very poor job on understanding the evidence on which their policies are based and should do a lot more about it. And I think 3I has been increasingly influential in working with low and middle income countries in that direction. But the second area, I think, is what you might call the international policy communities around these big issues. And to my mind, a systematic review like this is really gold dust for the international policy communities debating what to do next in this space. And I think that 3I is really to be congratulated not only on carrying out the systematic review program, which has been supported by DFID and other donors, but also now in building on top of its 700-page report, which could have been presented today, the report we're celebrating, which is a readable length, and indeed the summary, which is something you could read on the train very quickly. And I think that putting over the evidence is now becoming, as we get a bigger body of evidence, the key issue is how do we then help change behavior by making this accessible and having a good debate about it. And that's what we're here for this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. So I've been told that please announce that people tweeting should use #3IE education. So please go ahead and do that. So as Richard said, what we're really launching here is not the full report. That was actually available online a few months ago. But we're launching the summary report, which, as you can see, is based on that full report. What I'm going to do now is introduce our panel. So our feature speaker is Birte Snilstveit of 3IE. Birte is, of course, leading our work on, one of the ones leading our work on systematic reviews and evidence gap maps here in the London office. She is the lead team leader of this big project that produced this report. She's also an editor of the IDCG Campbell collaboration. And Birte has worked for many years on synthesis work, but has also worked previously with a number of more organizations that I think she's old enough to have worked on, but certainly the World Bank, DFID, Economist Intelligence Unit, and a variety of other organizations. Birte will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes to present the report, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. We have a very distinguished panel with us today. We have Sally Gear, who is just taken on the job of Head of Profession of Education at UK DFID. Sally has worked on girls' education for over 15 years. And prior to joining DFID, she lectured in social development and gender and development at Manchester University. We have to her left, not necessarily politically or economically speaking, David Evans, who is a senior economist at the World Bank. He's in the Chief Economist Office for the Africa region of the banks. He coordinates many of the impact evaluation work in that part of the bank, and he's also himself done quite a bit of research on systematic reviews in education. David has worked in Latin America and the Caribbean region, but now he's engaged in a very important endeavor, which is part of the core team to produce the next World Development Report, which will be on education in about a year's time. And we have Caine Rolleston, who is a senior lecturer in education and international development at the Institute of Education. Caine has led the education research within Young Lives. It's a very famous program, and worked on education and international development in a range of countries, including Ghana, Vietnam, Ethiopia, Peru, India, and Sri Lanka. So welcome, Caine. So without further ado, I turn it over to Birte to present us with the key findings of this report.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you, Richard, for your nice introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here. First, I'd like to start by acknowledging the team. This has been a massive piece of work, and we've been a big team, and also with great support from other colleagues working on policy and communications at 3IE. So, education is essential for the development of people and the development of countries. Today, more than ever before, having a good education makes the difference between being able to secure a stable, well-paid job and living a life with job insecurity and poverty. And all of us in this room are lucky enough to have had the benefit of a good education, and that is why we're here. This month we've seen the launch of two major reports on education, so the Global Education Monitoring Report and the report on financing for education by the International Commission on Education. And both reports make a very strong case for the importance of education for development. Education plays a role for reducing poverty and inequality. It helps drive economic growth of countries. It contributes to empowerment of women. So we shouldn't consider education as just another sector in development. It really is at the core of development. So if we care about development, we should care about education. But the key findings of these reports also make clear that there is a global learning crisis. So today, in 2016, 263 million children are out of school, and another 300 million children who are in school are not actually learning. So without a course correction and following the current trend, it's clear that we will miss the Sustainable Development Goals on education. So the prediction is that we will not achieve universal primary completion before 2042, and universal upper secondary education we will not achieve before 2084. So that's a long time, and many of us will no longer be there then. So the conclusion of these reports are very clear. We need to put in an effort to improve learning outcomes for children in low and middle income countries. So the Education Commission calls for a tripling of resources by 2030 to address this issue. But the report also makes clear that just increasing funding is not enough. So we need to do more, but we also need to do it better. So we need to develop strategies which is informed by the evidence. And the review that we're launching today was designed to help make those kind of investments, to identify the programs that work, the programs that are promising, and the programs that maybe don't work. So we had 4 research questions that drove our work. So first of all, we were interested in looking at the effects of education programs, broadly defined, on participation and learning outcomes for primary and secondary school children in low and middle income countries. And we also wanted to see whether the effects differ by different subgroups of children. So do programs affect girls and boys differently, for instance? And then we also wanted to look at the evidence on intervention, implementation and design feature, which might be associated with success and failure of interventions. And finally, also the identify contextual factors that are related to the effectiveness of education interventions. So I think this diagram is, I think, on page 9 of the report, so it might be easier to see there. So we know that learning and school participation is influenced by a range of different factors. So children's health and nutrition, their families' financial situation, what they meet when they come to school, and the governance and management of the school system. So if children attend school and they're hungry, they might be less able to learn. If they attend school but the teachers are not attending regularly, or the teachers are not properly trained, they will not learn. And similarly, if there are no materials, or the materials are not appropriate, maybe they're not in the children's mother language, these are also factors that are barriers to learning outcomes. So our brief was really to do a systematic review on education for primary and secondary school children, focusing in particular on learning outcomes. So we used this idea and kind of research on the different spheres of children's lives that influence their school participation and learning to develop a conceptual framework to organise our review. So we organised the different interventions that we looked at according to the main barriers that they're trying to address. So we've got child-level interventions, which are things like school feeding and merit-based scholarships. We've got household-level interventions, which are things like cash transfer programs or reducing user fees. We've got systems-level programs, which are interventions that are designed to address governance, school governance and management issues. Then we've got school-level programs, which are trying to address what happens when children are in the classroom, so materials, computer-assisted learning, etc. And finally, programs targeting teachers, so teacher training and teacher hiring programs. And so we use this framework to organise the way that we did the review and the way that we present our analysis. So we sifted through a lot of literature, and I think also in your report you will see in the early sections on page 11 there's a diagram which is actually breaking down the different stages that we went through in sifting through the literature. And so we ended up with 238 studies that met our inclusion criteria. And so 238 studies might seem like quite a lot, and particularly for those of you who have done systematic reviews. I'm certainly not aware of any review in international development that have included that many studies. But when you look at the scope of the review, actually the evidence base is not that extensive. When you consider that we looked across more than 20 different interventions, 7 different types of outcomes, and across over 100 different countries. So actually what we find in terms of the evidence base is that there are some areas where we can make some conclusions with fairly high level of confidence, but for many areas where significant resources are invested, we either conclude that we don't actually know about their effects, or for some programs we suggest that they're promising but more research is needed. So this doesn't mean that we should limit our investments in a new program or limit our investments to only the programs that we've found work, but that we should integrate impact evaluations when we roll out new programs where we're not certain about intervention effects. And also, so when it comes to the geographical coverage of the study, so we find that it's very uneven. So there's a difference between regions. So the region with the largest number of studies is Latin America, followed by Sub-Saharan Africa. But even within regions, there is the spread of studies is uneven. So there are some countries where we see there are a lot of studies, like in China, in India, in Kenya. But then there are some countries, including countries with large populations, like Bangladesh, Nigeria, and Indonesia, where we find either no studies or just a handful of studies. So, to the main findings. So the good news is that if we look across all of the studies that we identified, overall, these programs that have been evaluated improve outcomes in some way. So they do better than business as usual, but the overall effect is quite small. But then the key finding is that typically programs either improve learning outcomes or they improve school participation outcomes. There are a couple of possible exceptions to this. So we find that school feeding programs are promising for improving both participation outcomes and learning outcomes, particularly in contexts where there are issues with low school attendance and where malnutrition is a problem. And then we also find that community-based monitoring in some contexts have improved both school participation and learning outcomes. But apart from these two types of programs, either programs improve participation or they improve learning outcomes. And so the the strongest and most consistent finding of our review when we look at participation and learning outcomes respectively is that cash transfer programs seem to improve school participation outcomes in most contexts. And then when we look at learning outcomes, structured pedagogy programs also tend to improve learning outcomes in most contexts. And we've got quite a lot of studies supporting these findings. So I'm going to talk about those two types of programs in a bit more detail to give you an idea of the type of findings that we have. So cash transfer programs, many of you will be familiar with cash transfer programs. So they've been particularly popular in Latin America, where they're implemented as conditional cash transfer programs. So parents or households receive a cash transfer on a regular interval on the condition that their children attend school regularly. These programs have become very popular and spread to a range of countries in Asia and also in Africa. So we identified studies of 38 unique cash transfer programs. So it's kind of clearly the area where the evidence base is largest. And so this is kind of a summary plot of the results of our meta-analysis. And so it shows the average effect size measured in terms of standard deviations. And the yellow lines, that's the average effect size. And then the blue lines are the confidence intervals. So what we find is that there is a quite consistent pattern of improvement across a range of school participation outcomes. So both on enrollment, attendance, and school completion, we find the largest and most consistent effects across all the programs that we looked at. But when it comes to learning outcomes, we find that actually the effects are very small. So all the confidence intervals cross the line of no effect. So cash transfer programs, in most contexts, improve learning, but improve participation, but they don't improve learning outcomes. And so on learning, so there are these group of programs that we call structured pedagogy programs. So they typically aim to introduce some new content to class, and that content is supported by, often there are quite structured lesson plans for teachers and materials for teachers, often materials for children, and some training for teachers in delivering the new material. So we identified 22 studies of pedagogy programs across 11 different countries. The majority of these studies were from sub-Saharan Africa. So I guess one thing to note is that we see that actually for all the learning outcomes that we looked at, there is a consistent pattern of improvement of learning outcomes, and it's the largest effect across the review, and there are quite a lot of studies contributing to this finding, although there is still some variation across contexts. But so actually not that many studies look at school attendance outcomes, but we find that overall they don't improve attendance outcomes. So why do structured pedagogy programs improve learning in most contexts? So something that I didn't mention earlier on is that the type of review that we did, so it's a systematic review, but we used mixed methods. So the results that I've just presented are based on quantitative impact evaluations, but we also did a targeted search for process evaluations, project documents, qualitative studies, which might help us explain the results and explain variations between different contexts. So for the structured pedagogy programs, some of the findings suggest that actually, so a key explanation for the effectiveness of these programs is that they identify key constraints in the classroom, and there is a package of different intervention components that try to address these constraints. So there is new material and appropriate material that for many of these programs is focus on the material and the delivery being in the mother language of children. And there is some training for teachers in most cases to deliver it. Secondly, we think that so these programs have quite short causal chains. So as compared to, say, programs that maybe try and address the system, or these programs are targeting directly what's happening in the classroom. So in terms of potential for implementation failure, for example, that might be less. And in the cases where we see successful programs, typically the school materials were tailored to the children's context. And we also see there appears to be a pattern that when the materials and teaching was provided in the children's mother tongue, then the programs were more effective. And so, because we do see in some cases these programs work in most contexts, and in some contexts the effects are larger than the average effect, but there are also some cases where the programs didn't work, and so from the qualitative evidence, it seems that in many of the cases when it didn't work, the new content was not, it was delivered in English, so and that was either by design or by implementation. So there are cases where the program was designed to be delivered in the children's mother language, but in reality teachers used English to deliver them, and even punished children who used the local language. Another example of I guess the importance of this package is, so there's a study from Uganda where the researchers are testing two different versions of a program. So they're testing a kind of full package and then a lower cost package, where the training for the teachers is less intensive and there are less materials. And they do find that actually for the more intensive version there is a large positive effect on learning, whereas in the low-cost version, for some outcomes actually there is potentially a negative effect. And so they suggest a number of reasons that might explain this. So in particular, so the lack of so one of the materials that was delivered in the high cost version, more intensive version, was slates for the children to practice writing. And there were quite detailed lesson plans with focus on writing, but in the low cost, and the assumption was that the children would have notebooks. So in the low cost version, they would have notebooks that they could use instead of the slates. But actually, in reality, they didn't have notebooks. So what the teachers did was to often implement use air writing, which meant that the children got less practice in writing text, as was kind of assumed by the curriculum and lesson plans. But then there are a number of other programs where we concluded they're promising. So new schools and infrastructuring, so that includes both building schools but also providing toilets in schools. We conclude that they're promising for improving school participation outcomes, but we're less confident because we don't have that many studies. And then also public-private partnerships. So we find that public-private partnerships seem to be promising for improving school participation outcomes, particularly in very low-income contexts and where it's kind of low-cost private schools. But we don't see kind of an overall improvement of learning outcomes. And then for learning outcomes, we find that remedial education programs, so programs that try to target kids that need extra attention, they're promising, but we don't have that many studies, so we suggest that this is an area where we need some more research to see whether the quite impressive improvements that have been observed in some contexts can be replicated elsewhere. And then there are also some studies looking at extending the school day, where we see overall improvements in learning outcomes, which you might expect. But again, there aren't that many studies, so we're not that confident in that finding. So they're promising, but there's need for more research. And then for merit-based scholarships, we also see that there appears to be an overall improvement in learning outcomes in many contexts, but there is a need for more studies to identify maybe what contexts we're more likely to see those improvements. So we also find that there are some programs that don't always work. So what can we learn from the programs that don't always work? So I think computer-assisted learning programs and programs providing materials are examples where I think we can learn something from what the findings suggest. So for computer-assisted learning programs, we find that for language arts and composite test scores, the effects are very small and close to zero. But for maths, the effects seem to be, they're slightly larger. They're still not large, but the performance is overall better for maths. But so when we look at the different studies, what appears to maybe explain this is that in many of the programs, and actually in some programs, there's a negative effect on learning outcomes. So in some programs, there were issues to do with technological failure, so difficulties in implementing the program. Or the children were given computers or laptops, but it was not integrated with the curriculum, and the teachers were not given training in using the computers, which meant that in some contexts the teachers weren't actually, so the computers were delivered but they weren't used. And then in the case of learning materials, we find that overall programs just providing textbooks do not appear to kind of overall improve learning outcomes. And so again, there are issues to do with implementation. So, for example, in Sierra Leone, many schools didn't receive the textbooks, so it's no wonder there was no improvement in outcomes. But in other schools, because the school managers were not confident about the sustainability of the supply of books, many of the books were kept in storage instead of being used. And in the case of Kenya, the books were in English, which was for many kids the third language, so the material was too difficult. So this doesn't mean that children don't need materials or books to learn. It just means that our interpretation is that just kind of parachuting in computers or textbooks is not enough. And when we look at the structured pedagogy, where we have among the strongest effects on learning, providing materials is a key part of it, but it's part of a package. So in terms of implications for research, so I think an important but quite disturbing finding of the review is that we don't know enough about what are the best strategies for tackling the learning crisis. So to help identify more solutions, there is a need for more funding for research. Currently, it's a small fraction of what's spent on operations goes to actually researching and identifying programs that work. And we also think that these studies, we need not just more studies, but better studies. And so that means mixed method studies that look at process and implementation, pays attention to context, and also studies that assess cost. We wanted to look at costs, but very few studies actually collect that data. And this whole kind of complex process of identifying associated project documents and process evaluations, we had to do that to compensate for the lack of that type of information in primary studies. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there are kind of an imbalance in the spread of evidence in terms of both intervention types and geography. So we think that the studies need to be targeted to address those gaps. A very worrying finding, we think, particularly considering the agenda to leave no one behind, is that actually our efforts to look at effects on different population groups, and particularly more disadvantaged groups, we were in the end not really able to do that because most primary studies don't report their results disaggregated by children's characteristics. So in a systematic review, we can only work with what we have from the primary studies, and so new studies should take this seriously. And finally, there's a need for better reporting in primary studies. So what we found was that poor reporting in primary studies limits the usefulness of the results. In many cases, we have to write to the authors to get the data that we need to actually be able to use their findings. There are limited descriptions of interventions and of contexts. There's a lack of detail on methods. So there's a need for better reporting. So overall, what does the review tell us about how we move from the learning crisis to the learning generation, which the recent reports call for? So a key finding is that there is no magic bullet. One size does not fit all education outcomes. And the programs typically improve either learning or participation, but not both. So this means that tackling the learning crisis, we need to address multiple barriers to quality education. And finally, intervention strategies need to be tailored to the local context. So design programs that are addressing the main barriers in a specific context. To ensure all children get the education that they have the right to, and which will enable them to contribute to the development of their countries, we need the political will to dedicate enough resources and to use research evidence to guide how we invest those resources. This review is not an academic exercise for us. We hope that you will help us to make sure that it gets used. Thank you.